So you mentioned the ending of a lot of these choir schools, and the traditional economy of music that had existed before the Reformation. Can we just get an overview of this musical world which was disrupted, and specifically not so much the polyphony, but the framework in which polyphony existed, the framework on which it elaborated, that of plainsong?
And that was something I decided to talk about quite a bit in the book because I think you really can't understand Talus's music without understanding his background as his training, and especially the fact that for every piece of composed polyphony, every piece of music in parts, you would have heard 20 pieces of chant. If you think of the whole liturgy that was going on before the Reformation, certainly, the the chant was this tree, and the polyphony was this little ornament on top, was this very almost decorative sort of thing that happened at special times. So the first musical source that I talked about in the book wasn't by Tallis at all. It was actually the book of chant that he would have used when he was young, when he was being trained as a chorister. And we don't know exactly where he grew up. We know almost nothing about his family. Again, it's quite a jolt going from Byrd, where we know about his siblings and the fact that he was from this family in London. With Tallis, it's kind of a blank, but we do have this book that was being used by pretty much all the churches and cathedrals in England in that generation. This beautiful, large printed book called the Antiphonale, the antiphonal for the divine office, for the liturgy of the hours, as we call it now. And this was a big sort of double-sized book designed to be put on a stand and usually shared between 2 or 3 people. In fact, we have a wonderful document that talks about somebody who was sharing this book and wouldn't let the other guy see it. It was hogging the book. And he actually got reported to his boss, essentially, for not letting his colleague anywhere near the book. And anyone who's had to sing or play off a shared piece of music knows how frustrating that can be. But this was this big monumental book. It was printed, and I think we'll get back to the music printing industry a bit later, but it was printed, and so it would be uniform in every single church, and had thousands of pieces of chant in it, organized by the liturgical year. So, in fact, the beginning of the book is the first Sunday of Advent, and you kind of take it forward from there. And a lot of the melodies in there, a lot of the chants, are melodies that Tallis composed on later. If you go through his music and you take it apart, you find all these little melodies inside it. And we also know that these are melodies that Tallis would have improvised on, because his job in a lot of places was not specifically composer, it was organist. And that's what organists did, and they do a lot of that even now. They improvised. And what they were doing when Tallis was young was mostly improvising on chant. So the stuff in this chant book was the sort of the soil in which he grew as a musician, was his ambience, was almost the oxygen that he was breathing.
Can you give us a picture of the life of the choristers at that time?
Not always very easy. They worked hard. They worked long hours. In some ways, being a pre-Reformation chorister was almost like some of the child athletes that you see nowadays, the kids that do gymnastics or whatever, where you go away from home when you're 8 or 9, you do this thing that's really physically demanding, you see your family once in a while, you're not always happy with the diet, you're not always happy with the training, but you're also practicing this skill at this amazingly high level, in front of the most important people. And it's something that you can be really proud of, and it's something that's remembered, it's something that's noticed. And that this choir school system turned out some spectacular musicians. And there's a whole sort of subgenre of poems and songs, basically choristers complaining about how rough the life is. And I quoted a few of those in the book, but it was intense. It was very, very intense. But you look at the quality of musicians that it turns out, and even now in the English cathedrals, things aren't physically quite as intense as they would have been in 1520. They basically, the kids go to school all day, they have a rehearsal, they sing evensong, then they all have dinner and go to the dorm and go to bed, but do not get up at 5 a.m. the next day to sing matins. But it's still that choir school system still produces really extraordinary musicians, especially in terms of sight reading. Because when you sing a new service every single day, whether it's 8 services, as they did in the old days, or even just 1 or 2, that is going to build your sight reading skills, when you're doing it at that age. And so you get these English choral singers that can just sight read circles around everyone else. And we, just given the amount of
Mm.
music the English were cranking out, we know they were that good. They must have been that good in Talus's time.
What kind of establishments would these schools be connected to? Would they be typically connected to a monastery? Would they be ever connected to a parish church?
A lot of monasteries definitely had choir schools. And that was one of the pieces of damage at the Reformation, was that those went away. And of course, the women's monasteries, the convents had choir schools for girls, some of them. And that was the one place where a girl could go to get musical training, at least in sacred music, and those were out. And some of the women went into teaching in private households, but that sort of opportunity was gone. The cathedrals obviously had them. And in fact, some of the cathedrals were run by monks. So when the monks were thrown out, they just refounded them with a new set of clergy and kept the boys. So in fact, Tallis, as a grown-up, was at Canterbury Cathedral for a little while. And it had been a monastic cathedral, but they just, under new management, kept all the singers. Some parish churches had choir schools as well. In fact, another place where Tallis was for a while, in London, he was at this wonderful little parish that was near the fish market, and they had a choir school. They had a special little room for it. They had a fireplace in the room because, you don't want the kids to be cold. And you think of these, in some cases, really tiny little parishes where there might just be a few hundred people living within the boundaries, but they cared enough about music to, put together these schools and bring in the kids, even if it was just 3 or 4 of them. This particular parish, we know that they had a straw mat made for the boys to stand on in church because, it gets cold, your feet get cold. It's hard standing through these long services. And the mat was only 6 feet long. It's just a couple of yards. So we're not talking these huge ranks of boy choristers like you see at, at the lessons and carols from King's College. This was just a few children, but they were still educating them, and they still made the time for that. They still integrated them into this music. So yeah, with Tallis, we don't know if he came from some big cathedral or just from one of these little parishes that still cared about educating its kids in music.
Kerry, have you been able to sing professionally at all in the past since March?
I was very lucky in that we never stopped having singing at my church. We just put it on the live stream for a couple months and then started bringing people back.
Oh, very nice.
But having that kind of disruption, I kind of understand maybe what Tallis felt like during some of these strange events. I think about his first gig at Dover Priory, where they just shut the thing down, kicked everyone out. I think of Waltham Abbey, which was the last monastery he worked in. And he wasn't a monk. He was a layman, but he sort of made a living when he was younger, mostly playing the organ for monks. And Waltham Abbey was the last monastery in England to go down. They got shut down 2 weeks before Easter, which is about what happened to us, And you don't know what's going to happen next. I mean, it's all very easy to write sort of historical reflections on it from hindsight, but there's something about being inside a disruption like that. You don't see very clearly. All of a sudden your your vision is sort of blurry. But I like to think it can give us, some kind of empathy with these people who were having things forced on them and experiencing strange things that sort of weren't in the script. That's not what they signed up for when they signed that contract to be an organist for the nice monks in Canterbury or wherever.
Yeah, and the book you talked about, in one particular abbey, they were interrupted in the middle of their singing, and they weren't allowed to finish, and that was it.
Yeah, middle of Vespers, you go home. It's not safe. Go home. I understand that now.
Yeah, crazy.